Several years ago, an English journalist was about to write a book. He had been struck by the premature death of only after 33 days Pope John Paul I died. And, of course, naturally, the conspiracy theorists, even in 1978, were convinced that he had been murdered. I will get to the conclusion of the book in a moment, but it was not his conclusion that the Pope had been murdered. But through much effort on his own part and the intercession of a British cardinal, he was able to get an audience with Pope John Paul II, the successor. And he said, I had all my questions prepared that I was going to ask him once I was in his presence. And he said, when that opportunity came and I entered the presence of the Holy Father, I couldn't say anything. I was so overcome with being in the presence of a Roman pontiff that I just stood there and smiled, and he smiled back and gave me the rosary beads, which is my tradition, and it was over. So he missed his golden opportunity to really ask an in-depth question. I'm not quite sure. I think the Holy Father would have used that as an opportunity to respond. But later on, his name was John Cornwell. John Cornwell did go on to write a book. It's called A Thief in the Night. And his conclusion was not that someone killed the Holy Father. I think his conclusion was actually much worse. He said he died of neglect. And the mere fact that the Holy Father's health would be neglected in the Vatican is, to me, a much more condemning observation than if we would have killed him. There's a long story about even that. And the Holy Father had to take some responsibility for that too. But the point being is, more the issue is the questions that we have about life and why. Maybe why is there suffering in our world? Why do sometimes people we love get sick, pass away? Why is there so much poverty, hunger, and war in our world? There's a lot of things we may have questions about. Why did you create the world this way? Why did you use a committee of human beings? You know, it's very interesting. St. Thomas Aquinas says, you know, did God have to send Jesus in the world to achieve salvation? He says, of course not. I mean, Aquinas was always for the will of God. And he says, no, he could have simply willed that we be saved. And there would have been no need for the incarnation. But God chose to work in human history, work with humankind, and send Jesus among us to show us how to live. But many of us may have many questions about the world. Yet, we realize we do have limitations about certain things. I don't care how much time I spend in study, I will never understand physics or trigonometry. And I don't think that when I am in the presence of the Lord that I will even waste his time or mine asking him to finally explain it to me. I think I'm going to be so overcome with the magnificence of God that when I finally get that opportunity, you might say, to ask those big questions in life, I'm not sure I think I'm going to, those questions which seem so important here are not going to be important at all once we're in divine presence, once we see God as God is. But we're not patient. And we see these things in the world, and a lot of times people actually lose their faith. They deny Jesus. They deny either God's love in the world or God's love for us. And yet, Jesus says at the end of the very same gospel, if you believe in me or acknowledge me, I will acknowledge you. But if you deny me, I will deny you. And so, to keep from sort of denying the Lord, finding ourselves, well, if I can't explain it, then it just must not simply be true. And to keep from falling into that, I think, is we need to look at the book of Job. Job is a wonderful book. Apparently now there is a video on Prime, which is the story of Job. I have not seen it yet, but I'm curious now because I love the story of Job. Now, there are several clues in the very beginning that this is a parable. There was never a person by the name of Job. The reason I say that is because it begins by saying that God is in his heaven and Satan wanders by. Well, first of all, that's your first clue. God and Satan are not BFFs. They're not going to hang out together. And so, and the other thing I was curious, because in the scripture it says, Satan comes to him in the breezy part of the day. I've always been curious on when is the breezy part of the day. But anyway, God says to Satan, have you seen my servant Job? Have you seen how wonderful and holy and righteous? And Satan says, well, yeah, but what have you done for him? 7 sons, 7 daughters, 15,000 sheep, 10,000 head of cattle. Yeah, he's grateful. Well, what do you suppose you should do? Or we can test that. And he goes, well, that's exactly it. Let me get him. And what God says, and again, another part of the story I don't like, God says, all right, you can take everything from him, but you cannot take his life. And so within chapter, not even maybe a chapter, much less 2, a storm hits his house, kills all of his children, 14 children. Then robbers come and steal all of his sheep and cattle. And then even then, he does not deny the Lord. And so Satan comes to him again and says, well, see, but we haven't done enough. Let me make him sick, as long as you don't take his life. And so he gets boils and all kinds of things. Finally, and then his 3 friends show up and really mess up everything, but that's a whole other story. You have to read that for yourselves. But in the end, Job is granted an audience with God. He's not dead, he just gets to see God and basically defend himself. And God listens. And then God essentially puts Job in his place. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the universe? Did I consult you when I measured out the depths of the oceans? Where were you when I created Adam? And of course, Job, with his tail between his legs, has to sort of bend his head, and God essentially says, yeah, now you just shut up and do as you're told. Another part of the Job story that I'm not particularly fond of, because it really doesn't respond to really that burning question, why is there suffering? St. Augustine says that evil is the absence of the good. Well, that's an easy way to memorize what evil is. I don't find it a very satisfactory answer. It's true, but it doesn't really get to the heart of what's the purpose. And that's the part, the question, that the answer will only come to us probably in heaven. Those of us who have lived long enough and have the separation, the distance of time, can look back at our lives and think of moments where there was suffering in our own life. And we may think, I would not want to live through that ever again. And yet, if we are honest with ourselves, we can look and say, there were some positives that came from that. I grew as a person. I became more compassionate and more loving as a person because this happened to me. Because we have that temptation of Jeremiah towards vengeance and wanting to get even. That's not the will of God. So in this life, we must live, sort of acknowledge that there are some things we're not ever going to know the answer to. And in part, because the answer is far beyond us. But that's where faith comes in trusting. That, as Jesus says, everything that is concealed will be revealed.